To most of the world, Martin Luther King Jr. is a monument in motion, a man frozen at a podium in Washington, a voice echoing through grainy recordings about dreams and justice and the long arc of the moral universe. But away from microphones and marches, there was another Martin, a father who played the piano with his kids, knelt on the floor to tie shoelaces, and tried to build a sense of normality inside a house that received death threats as routinely as most homes receive phone bills. At the center of that house were 4 children who would grow up watching their father become a martyr before they were old enough to fully understand what the word meant. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King had 4 children in the span of 8 years. Yolanda Denise, born in 1955. Martin Luther King III, born in 1957. Dexter Scott, born in 1961. And Bernice Albertine, born in 1963. They were raised in Atlanta, in a family that looked, at first glance, like any other mid-century household. Piano in the living room, framed photographs on the wall, a father who sometimes returned home exhausted from work. But their father's work meant marches, bomb threats, jail cells, and a growing pile of FBI files. Their childhood photographs show both sides at once. A man laughing with his children, and a man whose every public step drew him closer to the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. On April 4th, 1968, that balcony became the dividing line in all of their lives. Yolanda was 12. Martin III was 10. Dexter was 7. Bernice had turned 5 just a week earlier. One moment, they had a father who came and went between campaigns and home. The next, they had a legacy that the entire world claimed as its own. From that day forward, every classroom, every headline, every holiday bearing his name pressed the same question onto them. What do you do when your last name is King? Your father is history, and the country keeps asking you to finish his work. Each child answered that question differently. Yolanda, the eldest, turned to the stage, using drama and storytelling to keep her parents' message alive. Martin III stepped into direct activism and leadership, serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and later becoming a public voice wrestling openly with what it meant to emerge from my father's vast shadow. Dexter focused on protecting the King legacy through legal and media work, chairing the King Center and navigating high-stakes battles over his father's image and intellectual property until his death from prostate cancer in 2024. And Bernice, the youngest, became a minister and lawyer, ultimately leading the King Center and turning her grief into a sustained campaign for nonviolence, in a world still struggling with the same triple evils her father named: racism, poverty, and militarism. This is not just the story of a civil rights icon. It is the story of 4 children who learned early that their family album was also a public archive, that their losses would be analyzed in newspapers, and that their attempts to live ordinary lives would always be measured against a man the world insists on calling a saint. In this countdown, from number 4 to number 1, we will follow Yolanda, Martin III, Dexter, and Bernice as they move from stunned children on a terrible April day to adults who carried, reshaped, and sometimes wrestled with the King legacy on stages, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in pulpits across the world. Number 4. Yolanda Denise King. Number 4 is Yolanda Denise King, the eldest child of Martin Luther King Jr., born in 1955, the one who entered the world before her father became a national figure, before the marches and the speeches and the constant surveillance transformed the King household into a moral battleground. She was old enough to remember her father as a man, not a monument. The way he read to her, teased her, held her hand, and tried, in the brief intervals between campaigns, to build a childhood untouched by the storm gathering outside their Atlanta home. Those memories became the raw material of her adulthood, shaping her identity long after the gunfire in Memphis ended his life. Yolanda grew up in the crucible of the civil rights movement. She watched her parents return home exhausted from mass meetings, face bomb threats at all hours, and comfort neighbors terrorized by segregationist violence. She understood fear earlier than most children do. Yet she also understood purpose. because her father took great care to explain, even to a small girl, why marches mattered, why suffering had meaning, and why justice demanded sacrifice. She later said that those lessons were her first education, long before she sat in any classroom. The turning point came on April 4th, 1968. At 12 years old, she had already learned to brace herself for danger, but nothing prepared her for the moment her father was taken from her. She became, overnight, the eldest child in a fatherless household, a position that demanded strength beyond her years. She helped her younger siblings navigate their confusion, comforted her mother when crowds filled the house in waves of grief, and learned quickly that her family's private pain had become the country's mourning ritual. As an adult, Yolanda chose the stage as her medium. She studied theater at Smith College and later at the New School in New York, using performance to humanize the parents the world often treated as symbols rather than people. Her plays, lectures, and storytelling tours brought audiences into the emotional center of the King legacy. The family dinners, the laughter, the tenderness, the spiritual discipline that shaped the public courage. She refused to let her father be confined to marble statues or oversimplified narratives. Through art, she restored his humanity. Yolanda co-founded Higher Ground Productions, using drama as a tool for social change, and traveled widely to speak about nonviolence, racial harmony, and the unfinished work her parents began. Her voice was not fiery like her father's. It was steady, measured, and deeply personal. A reminder that the civil rights movement was built not only on marches, but on families who risked everything. She died unexpectedly in 2007 at the age of 51. Her passing left a quiet ache in the King family. But her legacy endures in the countless young people who heard her speak and for the first time understood Martin Luther King Jr., not only as a leader, but as a father. Through Yolanda, the story of the King family becomes intimate. The story of a daughter turning memory into purpose, grief into illumination, and art into a bridge between past and future. Number 3. Martin Luther King III. Number 3 is Martin Luther King III, born in 1957, the only son of Martin Luther King Jr., and the child whose very name carried a weight no boy could fully understand. From the moment he could walk, he lived inside a dual reality, one in which his father was a towering moral leader shaping the destiny of a nation, and another in which that same father knelt down to help him with homework, tucked him into bed, and tried to shield him from the dangers closing in on their family. Martin III would grow up wrestling with that duality for the rest of his life. As a child, he watched his father leave for marches in the South, return home with bruises and exhaustion, and sit quietly at the kitchen table writing speeches that would later be quoted by presidents and schoolchildren. To the world, his father was prophetic. To him, his father was a warm but often distant figure. Distant not by choice, but by history's demands. Martin III remembered nights sleeping on the floor with his siblings after another bomb threat hit their home. The sound of sirens, the whispered conversations adults had when they thought the children were asleep. These moments formed the backdrop of his entire childhood. The turning point in his life came on April 4th, 1968. He was 10 years old when the news reached Atlanta that his father had been murdered on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. In that instant, childhood ended. Martin III assumed a role he had never prepared for. The only male heir to a legacy the entire world felt entitled to interpret. Throughout his adolescence, he struggled with internal pressure. The expectation that he would become the next Dr. King, that somehow he should fill the void left by a man whose life was defined by spiritual conviction and extraordinary courage. As an adult, Martin III stepped into public life cautiously. He became a civil rights advocate, community organizer, and eventually the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the same organization his father had co-founded. His leadership was marked not by fiery rhetoric, but by quiet persistence. He fought for voting rights, fair housing, criminal justice reform, and nonviolence. continuing his father's work while openly acknowledging the impossibility of becoming his father's replica. Martin III's most compelling public moments often came when he confronted the weight of legacy directly. He spoke about standing under the Lincoln Memorial at the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, carrying his father's words while insisting that the struggle was far from complete. He led rallies calling for peaceful protest in moments when the nation felt pulled apart by violence. In each appearance, he demonstrated the same moral compass passed down to him, a compass tempered not by charisma, but by discipline and inherited conviction. His legacy is one of endurance. Martin Luther King III has carried one of the heaviest names in American history without allowing it to crush him. He has walked the line between family and nation, between expectation and individuality, between memory and modern struggle. Through him, the King legacy becomes not just a story of what one man accomplished, but of what a son must learn to carry in the aftermath of greatness and loss. Number 2. Dexter Scott King. Number 2 is Dexter Scott King, born in 1961, the third child of Martin Luther King Jr., and the son who would ultimately take on the most complex, controversial, and demanding role in the preservation of his father's legacy. He was only 7 years old when his father was killed, old enough to remember his voice, his presence, and the rhythms of their home life, yet young enough for grief to settle into his identity before he had the language to understand it. He later said that the moment he learned his father had been assassinated changed my life in ways I am still discovering. Dexter grew up introverted, sensitive, and observant, a child who often watched more than he spoke. Whereas his siblings expressed their father's legacy through activism, ministry, or performance, Dexter gravitated toward analysis and strategy. He was fascinated by law, media, archives, and the mechanics of how history is written. In the chaos that followed his father's death, the threats, the lawsuits, the constant pressure on the Shabazz children, Dexter found refuge in structure. His mother, Coretta, encouraged his intellectual curiosity, recognizing in him a mind suited to the difficult future responsibilities he would eventually shoulder. The turning point in Dexter's life came in the 1980s and 1990s, when he assumed major responsibility for the King Center and the King family estate. He stepped into these roles with a sharp awareness that his father's image was at constant risk of distortion through commercial misuse, political appropriation, or historical simplification. Dexter became the gatekeeper of the King legacy, managing copyrights, overseeing archives, and confronting those who tried to exploit his father's likeness or words. He often found himself at the center of legal battles, negotiating with film studios, government entities, corporations, and civil rights organizations. His work was controversial at times, precisely because it was so visible. Dexter insisted that the King family had both the right and the obligation to control how Martin Luther King Jr.'s message was used. He believed that preserving authenticity sometimes required conflict, and he did not shy away from it. Behind the courtroom dramas and public debates was a deeper truth. Dexter had taken on the responsibility of defending the integrity of a man the world constantly tried to reshape according to its own wants. He was also deeply invested in criminal justice and nonviolence education, and remained one of the most committed family members to exploring the unresolved questions surrounding his father's assassination. In the late 1990s, he surprised many by publicly meeting with James Earl Ray, the man convicted of assassinating Dr. King. After the meeting, Dexter stated he believed Ray had not acted alone. His quest for truth was not conspiratorial, it was personal. A son trying to fill the void that official investigations had left behind. Dexter Scott King died in January 2024 at the age of 62 after a long and private battle with prostate cancer. His death marked the end of a life spent almost entirely in service to memory. A life defined by loyalty to a father whose absence shaped every decision he made. Dexter's legacy is that of the Guardian. He was the one who stood at the gates of history, ensuring that Martin Luther King Jr. would not be flattened into a slogan or diluted into a myth stripped of struggle. He protected the truth, even when the truth was contested. And through him, we see a son who turned childhood grief into a lifelong commitment to preserving the meaning of one of the most important lives in American history. Number 1. Bernice Albertine King. Number 1 is Bernice Albertine King, born in 1963, the youngest child of Martin Luther King Jr., and the daughter who would grow into the role of moral and spiritual anchor for the King family. She was barely a toddler when her father was assassinated, too young to remember his voice clearly, but old enough for the absence to shape the contours of her entire childhood. In interviews, she later described herself as a child raised in grief, her earliest memories colored by a mother navigating widowhood under a nation's unrelenting gaze, and by siblings struggling to find their footing in a world permanently altered. As she grew, Bernice watched her siblings move into their own callings: theater, activism, administration, while she herself gravitated toward the spiritual and the reflective. She absorbed the teachings of her father, not through personal recollection, but through the rituals of home. Coretta reading his sermons aloud, community leaders visiting the house, and the steady presence of her mother's dignity in the face of political, legal, and emotional storms. Bernice became the quietest of the King children, but also the one who spent the most time studying the intellectual and spiritual foundations of her father's philosophy. The turning point in Bernice's life came through ministry. She earned degrees from Spelman College, then from Emory University's Candler School of Theology, and eventually became an ordained minister. For her, the pulpit was not an echo of her father's platform, but an avenue to articulate his message through her own voice. A voice shaped by scripture, trauma, reconciliation, and the longing for justice. She delivered sermons that blended theological depth with the emotional truth of being raised in the shadow of a national martyr. Her ministry made her not simply a keeper of the flame, but an interpreter of it. Bernice's most significant leadership chapter began when she became CEO of the King Center, founded by her mother in 1968. In this role, she transformed the institution into a modern force for nonviolence education, global peace initiatives, and youth leadership. She launched programs on conflict resolution, digital activism, and community healing, expanding her father's philosophy into contemporary struggles such as police violence, income inequality, and racial trauma in the 21st century. She spoke boldly during moments of national unrest, insisting that nonviolence was not passive, but disciplined and strategically powerful. Her public voice grew even stronger in the years after the deaths of her mother in 2006 and her sister Yolanda in 2007. And again after Dexter's death in 2024. As the last surviving daughter, Bernice has become the principal steward of the King family legacy, responsible not only for guarding its historical accuracy, but for ensuring it remains alive, urgent, and applicable. From the pulpit to the protest line, she has carried forward her father's message with a clarity rooted in faith and a conviction honed by loss. Bernice's legacy is that of transformation. She is the bridge between two eras, the final daughter of a movement that reshaped America, and a leader speaking into a century marked by new forms of injustice. Through her, the King story continues not as a memory, but as a living mandate. She stands as the final reminder that Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest dream was not a speech, but a future he hoped his children would build. And in Bernice, that hope found its most enduring architect. The story of Martin Luther King Jr. is most often remembered through marches, megaphones, and the stark images of a man confronting the soul of a nation. But when the crowds dispersed and the cameras turned away, his legacy lived on in the four children who spent their entire lives navigating the space between public history and private heartbreak. The King children were not just witnesses to the civil rights movement. They were shaped by it in ways few outsiders ever fully understood. Yolanda, the eldest, carried the earliest memories, the bedtime stories, the laughter, the warmth, and transformed them into art that humanized a man the world often elevated into abstraction. Her performances stitched emotion back into a narrative, too often flattened by textbooks and statues. Martin III stepped reluctantly but firmly into the world of activism, wrestling with a name that weighed heavily yet propelled him forward. He carried his father's message into rallies, negotiations, and political arenas, insisting at every step that the work of justice was unfinished, and that his father's dream demanded persistence, not nostalgia. Dexter became the guardian, the strategist, the defender of a legacy constantly at risk of dilution or misappropriation. He fought court battles, curated archives, and shielded his father's image with the same vigilance his father had applied to defending his community. His work ensured that history would remember not a sanitized caricature, but a man of depth, discipline, and conviction. And Bernice, the youngest, became the voice of the next era, a theologian, minister, and global ambassador of nonviolence. She inherited the moral weight of her father's teachings and reshaped them for a century marked by new struggles: police violence, digital injustice, global inequality, and the quiet wounds left by generational trauma. Together, the four King children created a mosaic of resilience, intellect, and purpose. Their paths diverged, their personalities clashed at times, and their public visibility rose and fell across decades. Yet there is a single thread running through everything they built: an unwavering commitment to truth. The truth about their father, their mother, and the movement that transformed a nation. They remind us that the cost of leadership does not end with the leader. It ripples through households, across generations, and into the lives of children who must find their own way through history's expectations. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a world where his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What he could not have foreseen is how powerfully their character would continue shaping the very world he dreamed of.